The sound of the organ at Greenwich Methodist Church echoed like a funeral march when Steve Whitmore adjusted his Armani tuxedo for the 10th time in 3 minutes. His hands were shaking. Not from romantic nerves, but the kind of panic you feel when you're about to sign a contract with the devil. "You have exactly 2 minutes to decide, Stephen." Eleanor Whitmore's icy voice cut through the air like a crystal blade. His mother stood impeccable in her navy Chanel suit, every pearl in place, every gray hair perfectly arranged. "Marry Vivian Ashworth as we planned 6 months ago, or—" She paused dramatically, her steel blue eyes locked on his. "Or lose everything. The inheritance, the company, your position in society, everything." Steve looked through the cracked sacristy door. There was Vivian Ashworth, 28 years old, oil fortune heiress, walking down the aisle in a dress that cost more than a Manhattan apartment. Blonde, elegant, absolutely suitable, and completely wrong. Because 3 rows back, trying to hide behind a bouquet of hydrangeas she was arranging as if her life depended on it, was Ruby Anderson. Ruby, with her messy chestnut hair pulled into a haphazard bun, wearing a vintage dress she probably found at some Brooklyn thrift shop. Ruby, who had walked into his life 6 months ago as the wedding florist and, without him realizing it, had stolen every coherent thought he'd ever had. 1 minute and 40 seconds, Stephen. Eleanor consulted her Cartier with a general's precision. Across the church, Marcus Pemberton, his best friend since Yale and official best man, was making frantic signals. Marcus, who had been secretly in love with Vivian for years and had orchestrated this exact moment with the subtlety of a drunk Shakespeare. Perfect, Marcus thought, adjusting his tie with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. In 90 seconds, either Steve marries the wrong woman and I console the rejected bride, or he runs off with the florist and I get Vivian. Either way, someone's going to need a shoulder to cry on today, and that shoulder will conveniently be mine. Ruby looked up for a moment, just a moment, and met Steve's gaze. In that second, the world stopped. It wasn't like in the movies, with swelling music and slow motion. It was like getting punched in the stomach while someone steals your breath and sanity at the same time. 1 minute and 15 seconds. Steve closed his eyes. 6 months ago, he was Stephen Montgomery Whitmore III, heir to a financial empire, fiancé to the East Coast's most coveted socialite, and a complete emotional idiot. Today, he was still an emotional idiot, but now he knew it, and all because of a florist who had the terrible habit of saying exactly what she thought. 50 seconds, Stephen. Make your choice. Steve opened his eyes and looked at his mother, the woman who had controlled every aspect of his life for 32 years. Then he looked at Vivian, who was being led toward the altar with the expression of someone heading to her own execution. Finally, his eyes found Ruby once more. She was biting her lower lip, that annoying habit she had when she was nervous, the same habit that had made him lose his composure in the first wedding planning meeting. 30 seconds. Steve's heart beat once, twice, 3 times, and then he did the one thing a Whitmore should never do. He ran. Steve Whitmore had never run anywhere in his life. Running was for people who couldn't afford cars or personal trainers, or the kind of lifestyle where movement was optional. But here he was, sprinting down the center aisle of Greenwich's most prestigious church in a $3,000 tuxedo, while 200 of the East Coast's elite watched in horror. "Stephen Montgomery Whitmore III!" Eleanor's voice could have shattered stained glass. "Get back here this instant!" But Steve was already past the point of maternal authority. He was past the point of sanity, actually. Because halfway down the aisle, he grabbed Ruby Anderson's hand and pulled her up from her seat. "What are you, Steve? Are you insane?" Ruby stumbled, her vintage heels catching in her dress hem. "This is your wedding." "No," Steve panted, not slowing down. "This is my jailbreak." Behind them, chaos erupted like someone had dropped a social bomb. Vivian Ashworth stood frozen at the altar, her mouth forming a perfect O of shock. The wedding guests were on their feet, phones already out, documenting what would undoubtedly become the scandal of the decade. Marcus Pemberton watched the spectacle with barely contained glee. Even better than I planned, he thought, straightening his boutonniere. Steve's having a public breakdown, Vivian's traumatized and vulnerable, and I'm about to become the hero who picks up the pieces. Sometimes the universe just hands you exactly what you need. Steve, seriously, put me down! Ruby was trying to dig her heels into the marble floor, but Steve had the advantage of desperation and upper body strength from years of rowing at the yacht club. Can't do that, Ruby. You're my witness. Witness to what? Your complete mental breakdown? Steve burst through the church doors into the bright afternoon sunlight, Ruby still attached to his hand like a very reluctant accessory. His Tesla was parked right at the curb. Thank God for small mercies in valet parking. Get in the car. I'm not getting in your car. I don't even know what's happening. Steve stopped running for the first time in 3 minutes and turned to face her. Ruby Anderson, with her flushed cheeks and wild hair escaping from that ridiculous bun, looked like she'd been struck by lightning, which, Steve realized, was exactly how he felt most of the time around her. Ruby. He was breathing hard, his perfectly styled hair falling into his eyes. 6 months ago, you told me I was an entitled ass who wouldn't recognize real love if it bit me on my perfectly manicured behind. I did not say perfectly manicured behind. I said, you said privileged ass, but I'm paraphrasing for dramatic effect. Steve fumbled with his car keys, his hands still shaking. The point is, you were right. About everything. About me being shallow. About me marrying Vivian for all the wrong reasons. About me being a complete disaster as a human being. Ruby stared at him. Okay, and? And I just left my own wedding. For you. So now would be a really good time for you to tell me I didn't just destroy my entire life for nothing. From inside the church, they could hear Eleanor Whitmore's voice rising to operatic levels of fury. Car doors were slamming. The cavalry was mobilizing. Ruby looked at the church doors, then at Steve's Tesla, then back at Steve himself. He looked like a man who had just jumped off a cliff and was hoping someone had thought to pack a parachute. You realize, she said slowly, that your mother is probably calling the police right now, and Vivian's father owns half the judges in Connecticut, and you just humiliated one of the most powerful families in... Ruby. What? Are you getting in the car or not? She bit that damn lip again. Steve was starting to think that particular nervous habit might actually kill him. Where exactly are we going, Steve? Because I have a flower shop to run, and a life that doesn't involve being an accessory to whatever midlife crisis you're having at 32. We're going to figure this out. Figure what out? Steve stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume. Something light and floral that probably cost less than his tie, but somehow made more sense than anything in his perfectly organized world. Whether you meant it. Meant what? What you said that day in the flower shop? About me being worth saving under all the expensive bullshit. Ruby went very still. Behind them, the church doors burst open, and Eleanor Whitmore emerged like an avenging angel in Chanel, flanked by what appeared to be every influential person in Greenwich. Ruby Anderson, Steve said quietly, I'm about to lose everything I've ever had. My family, my money, my entire world. And the only thing that seems to matter is whether you'll lose it with me. Ruby looked at the approaching mob, then at Steve's outstretched hand. You know what? She said, and Steve's heart stopped. I always thought your life could use a little more chaos. She got in the car. The Tesla's acceleration pinned Ruby against the leather seat as Steve floored it out of Greenwich like they were fleeing a zombie apocalypse. Which, considering Eleanor Whitmore's expression in the rearview mirror, wasn't entirely inaccurate. Holy shit, Ruby breathed, watching the church shrink behind them. I just became an accomplice to social suicide. Language, Ruby. Steve's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, but there was something almost manic in his grin. You're riding with Connecticut royalty now. Ex-royalty, you mean? I'm pretty sure your crown just got revoked back there. Steve's phone had been buzzing non-stop since they'd peeled out of the church parking lot. 17 missed calls from Eleanor, 12 from his father's lawyer, and one text from Marcus that simply read, "Dude, what the actual hell?" "So," Ruby said, adjusting her seatbelt and trying to process what her life had become in the last 10 minutes. "What exactly is the plan here? Because I'm assuming drive really fast while having an existential crisis isn't a sustainable long-term strategy." Steve glanced at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked uncertain. The arrogant mask had completely fallen away, leaving something raw and almost vulnerable underneath. "Honestly, I have absolutely no idea." "Great, that's reassuring." Ruby twisted in her seat to face him. "Steve, I need you to understand something. I'm not some rescue fantasy. I can't fix whatever's broken in your life by being the quirky girl who teaches you about real love or whatever romantic comedy nonsense you think this is." "I know that." "Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, this looks suspiciously like a very expensive midlife crisis with me as the unwilling props department." Steve was quiet for a long moment, navigating through traffic with the kind of aggressive precision that suggested he was working through something complicated in his head. "Do you remember," he said finally, "that day 3 months ago when you told me the centerpieces I'd chosen looked like dead flowers arranged by someone who'd never felt joy?" Ruby winced. That was harsh, even for me. It was also completely accurate. Steve merged onto I-95, heading north toward somewhere. "And then you spent 20 minutes explaining why peonies were better than roses, and you got so animated talking about the architectural integrity of natural beauty that you knocked over an entire display case. Oh God, I ruined those orchids. Your mother looked like she wanted to have me arrested." "My mother wanted to have you arrested because you were right, and she knew it, and she'd never met anyone who didn't immediately defer to the Whitmore family opinion on absolutely everything." Steve's voice got quieter. "And I sat there watching you argue with her about flower arrangements like it was the most important battle in the world, and I thought, when was the last time I cared about anything that much?" Ruby felt something dangerous flutter in her chest. "Steve, I'm not asking you to fix me, Ruby. I'm asking you to give me a chance to figure out who I am when I'm not being the person everyone expects me to be." Before Ruby could respond, Steve's phone rang. The caller ID made them both freeze. Vivian Ashworth. "Oh shit," Ruby whispered. Steve stared at the phone like it might explode. "I should answer it." "Should you, though? She deserves an explanation." "Does she? Or does she deserve better than an explanation from the guy who just left her at the altar?" Steve hit the accept button and immediately put it on speaker. Vivian's voice filled the car, and it wasn't at all what Ruby had expected. "Stephen Whitmore, you magnificent bastard." Ruby and Steve exchanged glances. That was not the tone of a devastated bride. "Vivian, do you have any idea?" Vivian continued, and Ruby could hear champagne glasses clinking in the background. "How long I've been waiting for someone to give me a legitimate excuse to get out of this ridiculous arrangement?" Steve nearly swerved off the highway. "What?" "Oh, don't act so surprised. We both knew this was a business merger, not a love story. The only difference is you grew a spine before I did." There was a pause, and then Vivian's voice got softer, more genuine. "Also, Marcus Pemberton just asked me to dance, and he's looking at me like I'm actually a person instead of a quarterly earnings report. So thank you, Stephen. For the first time in my life, I might actually get to find out what it feels like to be someone's first choice instead of their most practical option." The line went dead. Steve and Ruby sat in stunned silence as the Tesla hummed down the highway. "Well," Ruby said eventually, "that was unexpected." "Yeah." Steve was staring at the road with the expression of a man whose entire worldview had just been rearranged. "So, Marcus and Vivian, your best friend who's been secretly pining, and your ex-fiancé who apparently never wanted to marry you in the first place." Ruby shook her head. "This is either the most romantic thing I've ever been part of, or the most elaborate setup in dating history. Steve's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Marcus. "You owe me the biggest drink in Connecticut. Also, Vivian says thank you. Also, your mother just threatened to disinherit the entire East Coast. We should probably talk." "So," Steve said, glancing at Ruby with something that looked suspiciously like hope. "Now what?" Ruby looked at this man, this impossibly privileged, beautifully damaged man who had just thrown away everything he'd ever known because she'd told him he deserved better than a loveless marriage. "Now," she said, "we figure out if you're actually worth all this drama. And how do we do that?" Ruby smiled, and Steve felt something in his chest that he'd never experienced before, the terrifying, exhilarating sensation of free fall. "We start with lunch. I know a place." Ruby's place turned out to be a hole-in-the-wall diner called Mel's that looked like it hadn't been updated since 1987. The kind of place where the coffee came in chipped mugs and the waitresses called everyone Hon, whether they liked it or not. Steve Whitmore had never been anywhere like it in his life. "This is—" He slid into a cracked vinyl booth, his Armani tuxedo looking as out of place as a peacock in a chicken coop. "Charming. It's honest," Ruby corrected, flagging down a waitress with bright pink hair and at least 6 visible tattoos. "Hey, Dolores. Can we get 2 coffees and some privacy? My friend here just blew up his life and needs to process." Dolores looked Steve up and down with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every kind of human drama play out over hash browns and regret. "Honey, you look like you just escaped from something expensive and suffocating." She poured coffee without being asked. "Good for you. The meatloaf's fresh if you want something that'll stick to your ribs while you figure out your next move." Steve watched her walk away, genuinely bewildered. "She doesn't know who I am. Should she? I'm a Whitmore. People usually know who I am." Ruby stirred sugar into her coffee, watching him with those warm brown eyes that seemed to see straight through every defense he'd ever built. "And how does that feel, being nobody special for once?" Steve considered this, turning the chipped mug in his hands. "Terrifying. And kind of amazing. Welcome to how the other 99% lives, Steve." Before he could respond, his phone exploded with notifications. Social media alerts, news notifications, missed calls. The story was already everywhere. Whitmore heir abandons bride at altar. Greenwich wedding scandal rocks high society. Billionaire's son in dramatic church escape. "Christ," Steve muttered, scrolling through his phone. "TMZ already has photos." Ruby leaned across the table to look at the screen. One particular photo made them both freeze. Steve pulling Ruby from the church pew, her face a mixture of shock and something that looked suspiciously like excitement. "I look insane," Ruby said. "You look alive," Steve said quietly. "I look like I'm finally waking up." His phone rang again. This time it was his father. "Don't answer it," Ruby said immediately. "I have to." "No, you don't. That's the first thing you need to learn about not being a Whitmore. You get to choose which calls to take." Steve stared at the phone until it stopped ringing. Then it started again. "He'll keep calling," Steve said. "Let him." Ruby reached across the table and gently took the phone from his hands, powering it off. "For the next hour, you're not Stephen Montgomery Whitmore III. You're just Steve, a guy in a diner, figuring out what comes next." The silence felt strange. Steve couldn't remember the last time he'd gone an hour without checking messages, taking calls, or managing some crisis related to the family business. "So," Ruby said, breaking the quiet, "tell me something real." "Real?" "Something that has nothing to do with your trust fund or your family name or your social obligations. Something that's just you." Steve was quiet for so long that Ruby started to think he might not answer. Then quietly, "I wanted to be a teacher." "A teacher?" "High school history. I used to volunteer at an inner-city school in New Haven when I was at Yale. These kids who had nothing, but they'd get so excited about learning." Steve's voice got softer. "I was good at it. making them care about things that happened hundreds of years ago, helping them see how it connected to their lives now. Ruby felt that dangerous flutter again, stronger this time. What happened? My father found out. Said it was unseemly for a Whitmore to play at being middle class. Threatened to cut off my funding if I didn't quit and focus on business courses. Steve laughed, but there was no humor in it. I quit the next day. Haven't taught anyone anything since. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. Is it? Steve, you gave up something you loved, something you were good at, because someone else decided it wasn't appropriate for your social class. That's not just sad, it's tragic. Steve looked up at her, and Ruby saw something she'd never seen before in his eyes. Hope mixed with terror. What if it's too late? What if I've been playing the part of Stephen Whitmore for so long that there's nothing left of just Steve? Then we find out, Ruby said simply. But first, you have to decide if you want to. Decide what? If you want to be worth the chaos you just caused. Ruby leaned forward, her voice getting more intense. Because I meant what I said in the car, Steve. I'm not here to fix you or save you or be your manic pixie dream girl. I'm here because I saw something real in you that day you defended my flower arrangements to your mother, and I hope, there's more where that came from. Steve felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff again, except this time he could see what was at the bottom. The possibility of becoming someone he actually wanted to be. There's more, he said quietly. Prove it. How? Ruby smiled, and it was the kind of smile that could either save a man or completely destroy him. Easy. You're going to spend the next week living like a normal person. No family money, no Whitmore influence, no safety net. Just you, figuring out who you are when you can't buy your way out of problems. And if I can't handle it? Then you go back to Greenwich, apologize to everyone, marry whoever your mother picks out next, and we pretend this never happened. And if I can? Ruby's smile got wider, more dangerous. Then maybe, just maybe, you'll be worth all this trouble. Steve looked around the diner, at the mismatched chairs and the flickering fluorescent lights and the real people living real lives with real problems, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Excitement. 1 week, he said. 1 week. And you'll help me? Ruby extended her hand across the table. Partners in crime, Steve. But this time, we're stealing your life back. He shook her hand, and neither of them mentioned how neither of them let go for longer than necessary. Day 1 of Steve's crash course in normal human existence began at 6 a.m. with a rude awakening. Ruby's alarm clock sounded like a fire truck having a nervous breakdown. Rise and shine, sunshine, Ruby called from what Steve assumed was the kitchen, though the sound of something burning suggested that assumption might be optimistic. Coffee's ready, and by ready, I mean it exists. Steve rolled off Ruby's couch, a piece of furniture that had apparently been designed by someone who'd heard couches described but never actually seen one, and tried to remember the last time he'd woken up anywhere that didn't have Egyptian cotton sheets and a thread count higher than most people's salaries. Ruby's apartment was a studio in Brooklyn that could have fit in his walk-in closet. But somehow, with her vintage posters and mismatched furniture and plants hanging from every available surface, it felt more like home than his penthouse ever had. So, Ruby said, handing him coffee in a mug that read, World's Okayest Human. Ready for your first day of being nobody special? Steve took a sip of the coffee and tried not to wince. It tasted like it had been filtered through sadness and disappointment. This is strong. It's called Grocery Store Brand, Steve. Learn to love it because your champagne budget just became a tap water reality. She was wearing jeans with actual holes in them, not the designer kind that cost $800, but the kind that came from living, and an oversized sweater that looked like it had been stolen from someone much larger. Her hair was in a messy bun, secured with what appeared to be a pencil, and she looked absolutely gorgeous in a way that made Steve's chest hurt. First stop, Ruby announced, grabbing her keys. Employment office. Employment office? You need a job, Steve. A real job. The kind where you trade your time for money instead of just inheriting it. The employment office in downtown Brooklyn was exactly as soul-crushing as every movie had ever depicted. Fluorescent lights that hummed with existential despair, plastic chairs designed by enemies of the human spine, and a waiting room full of people who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Steve, still in yesterday's tuxedo pants and a borrowed t-shirt that read, "Brooklyn or Die," fit right in. Meanwhile, back in Greenwich, Marcus Pemberton was discovering that consoling a jilted bride was significantly more complicated than his romantic comedies had led him to believe, mostly because Vivian Ashworth wasn't acting jilted at all. "So," Vivian said, twirling the diamond engagement ring around her finger like it was a paperweight, "how long have you been in love with me?" Marcus nearly choked on his champagne. They were in the country club bar, surrounded by the wedding guests who'd stayed for what was now being called the most entertaining social event of the decade. Shit, Marcus thought. She knows. How does she know? I was subtle. I was the picture of subtle attraction. "I'm sorry, what?" he managed. "Marcus, you've been staring at me like a lovesick golden retriever for 3 years. Did you really think I hadn't noticed?" "I have not been staring at you like a lovesick anything." Vivian raised an eyebrow. "Last month's charity gala, you spent the entire evening following me around with champagne refills and asking if I needed anything. I was being polite. You asked me 17 times if I was too cold and offered me your jacket every 20 minutes. The venue was known for aggressive air conditioning. It was July, Marcus, in Connecticut, during a heat wave." Marcus stared into his drink, his carefully constructed facade crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. "Okay, fine. Maybe I've been aware of you." "Aware of me?" "Interested in you." "Interested?" Marcus looked up at her, and something in Vivian's expression made him abandon his last shred of dignity. "Fine. I've been completely, hopelessly, embarrassingly in love with you since the day Steve introduced us at your engagement party, and I've spent the last 2 years hating myself for it because you were supposed to marry my best friend, and good men don't steal their friends' fiancés, even when those friends are clearly making the biggest mistake of their lives." Vivian was quiet for a long moment, considering this. Then, 2 years? 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days. But who's counting? And you never said anything? What was I supposed to say? "Hey, Vivian, I know you're engaged to my best friend, but would you like to run away with me instead?" Vivian laughed, actually laughed, and Marcus felt something in his chest that might have been hope. That would have been a much more interesting conversation than most of the ones I've had lately. Back in Brooklyn, Steve was learning that entry-level positions apparently required experience, and experience required entry-level positions, and the whole system was designed to crush the hopes and dreams of anyone naive enough to believe in the concept of upward mobility. "Next," called the employment counselor, a woman who looked like she'd been personally defeated by every job application she'd ever processed.
Steve approached the desk with the same confidence he'd brought to boardroom meetings, which turned out to be exactly the wrong energy for someone whose resume consisted entirely of heir to fortune and Yale graduate with no practical skills. "And what kind of work are you looking for, mister?" She glanced at his application. "Whitmore. And I'm open to anything, really."
She looked him up and down, taking in the designer shoes and the posture of someone who'd never waited in line for anything in his life. "Anything? Well, anything appropriate for someone with my background." "Uh-huh. And what exactly is your background, Mr. Whitmore?" Steve realized he was about to have his first honest conversation about his qualifications in his entire life. "I have a degree from Yale in economics, no practical work experience, and I've recently discovered that everything I thought I knew about life was completely wrong." The counselor blinked. "That's refreshingly honest. I'm trying a new approach." She scrolled through her computer, shaking her head. "Look, Mr. Whitmore, I'm going to level with you. Most of these positions require references, work history, or skills you clearly don't have. But, she paused, considering something. There is one opening. It's not glamorous. I'm not looking for glamorous anymore. It's at Jefferson High School. They need a substitute history teacher. The pay is terrible, the hours are long, and the kids will eat you alive if you show them any weakness. Steve felt something electric run through him. A history teacher? You interested? Ruby, who had been waiting in the plastic chairs and eavesdropping shamelessly, watched Steve's face transform. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked like he was exactly where he belonged. Yes, Steve said. And there was something in his voice that made Ruby's heart skip. I'm very interested. As they walked out of the employment office with Steve clutching a slip of paper with the school's address, Ruby realized something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She was falling for him. Hard. And for the first time in her life, she thought she might actually be falling for the right person. Jefferson High School looked like it had been designed by someone who believed teenagers deserved to suffer in an environment as bleak as their attitude toward authority. The hallways smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams, and Steve had never felt more alive walking through them. You sure about this? Ruby asked, matching his pace as they navigated through crowds of students who looked like they could smell privilege from 3 blocks away. Because these kids are going to take one look at you and decide you're either a narc or someone's rich daddy having a midlife crisis. Let them, Steve said, clutching his borrowed messenger bag like a shield. Inside were lesson plans he'd stayed up until 3 a.m. preparing, fueled by Ruby's terrible coffee and something that felt suspiciously like purpose. The principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, met them at the main office with the weary expression of someone who'd seen every kind of disaster education could produce. Mr. Whitmore, I have to be honest. When the employment office called and said they had a Yale graduate willing to substitute teach for $38 a day, I assumed it was some kind of clerical error. No error, Steve said. I'm here because I want to be. Mrs. Rodriguez studied him with the sharp eyes of someone who'd learned not to trust anyone who claimed to want to work in public education. These aren't prep school kids, Mr. Whitmore. They're not going to be impressed by your credentials or intimidated by your background. Half of them are working part-time jobs to help their families pay rent. The other half are just trying to survive until graduation. Good, Steve said, surprising both women. Maybe they can teach me something about resilience. Ruby felt that dangerous flutter again, stronger this time. She was really in trouble. 20 minutes later, Steve stood in front of 32 10th graders who looked like they'd rather be literally anywhere else, including a root canal appointment or a tax audit. So, Steve began, perching on the edge of the desk in what he hoped was a casually approachable way, who can tell me why the Boston Tea Party wasn't actually about tea? Silence. The kind of silence that suggested his audience was collectively deciding whether to ignore him or actively sabotage him. Finally, a girl in the back row with purple hair and enough attitude to power a small city raised her hand. Because rich white guys were mad about taxes and decided to throw a tantrum about it? Steve grinned. Exactly. Rich white guys throwing a tantrum. Anyone want to guess what that might have in common with current events? A few students exchanged glances. Someone in the middle row, a kid who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, spoke up. Politicians. Politicians. Billionaires. Trust fund babies who think the rules don't apply to them. Steve was hitting his stride now, pacing in front of the whiteboard with the kind of energy that made even the most disinterested students look up from their phones. The question is, what do we do when the people with all the power are too disconnected from reality to make good decisions? More hands went up. The purple-haired girl again. Revolution? Revolution, Steve agreed. But what does that look like today? Because most of us can't afford to throw perfectly good tea into a harbor. Voting, someone called out. Protests, said another. Social media campaigns that actually matter instead of just complaining about celebrities, added a boy near the window. Steve felt the same electric excitement he'd experienced years ago at the community center in New Haven. This was what he'd been missing, the moment when young minds started connecting historical events to their own lives, when the past became a tool for understanding the present. Meanwhile, back in Greenwich, Marcus was learning that wooing Vivian Ashworth required significantly more strategy than he'd anticipated, mostly because she kept asking difficult questions. "So," Vivian said, swirling the wine in her glass as they sat in the country club's garden, "if you've been in love with me for over 2 years, why didn't you ever try to stop the wedding?" Marcus nearly choked on his salmon. "Stop the wedding? You knew I didn't want to marry Steve. You knew Steve didn't really want to marry me. You knew we were both just going through the motions because our parents expected it." Vivian leaned forward, her blue eyes sharp with curiosity. "So why did you let it get as far as it did?" "Because," Marcus thought frantically, "I was hoping for exactly what happened. A dramatic last-minute escape that would leave you vulnerable and grateful and definitely not asking me uncomfortable questions about my moral character. Because," he said aloud, "I respected your choices. And Steve's, even when I thought you were both making a mistake. That's very noble of you, Marcus. Thank you. It's also complete bullshit." Marcus set down his wine glass carefully. "I'm sorry. You didn't try to stop the wedding because you were hoping something exactly like this would happen. You were counting on Steve having a breakdown so you could swoop in and be the hero." Vivian's smile was sharp as a blade. "Weren't you?" Marcus stared at her, his carefully constructed romantic strategy crumbling in real time. That's a very cynical interpretation. But is it wrong?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Vivian Ashworth, he realized, was significantly more perceptive than he'd given her credit for, and significantly more dangerous. "No," he said finally. "It's not wrong." "Well," Vivian sat back in her chair, looking almost pleased. "At least you're honest about being manipulative. That's refreshing." "Vivian, Marcus, relax. I'm not offended." She took another sip of wine, considering him with new interest. "I'm impressed. That level of strategic thinking suggests you might actually be worth my time." Back at Jefferson High, Steve was discovering that teaching teenagers about history was like trying to herd caffeinated cats, exhausting, unpredictable, and surprisingly rewarding. "Mr. Whitmore," the purple-haired girl called out as the bell rang and students started packing up. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" "Planning on it." "Why?" "Because most substitutes don't make it past lunch on their first day." Steve looked around at the classroom, at the mismatched desks and the peeling motivational posters, and the kids who were already arguing about the Revolutionary War as they headed into the hallway, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years: belonging. "I'll be here," he said. Ruby was waiting for him in the parking lot, leaning against a beat-up Honda Civic that belonged to her friend Sarah, who worked in the school cafeteria. "So?" she asked as Steve emerged from the building looking simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. "How did it go?" "They're incredible," Steve said, and there was something in his voice that made Ruby's chest tight. Cynical and smart, and completely unimpressed by anything that doesn't matter to their actual lives. "I think I learned more from them in 50 minutes than I did in 4 years at Yale." "And tomorrow?" Steve looked back at the school, then at Ruby, really looked at her, like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "Tomorrow I get to do it again." He stepped closer, close enough that Ruby could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "And Ruby?" "Yeah? Thank you for believing I could be worth saving." The space between them felt electric, dangerous, full of possibility. Ruby realized she was holding her breath, waiting for something she couldn't name. But instead of kissing her, which would have been the obvious move, the expected move, Steve smiled and stepped back. "Come on," he said. "I owe you dinner, and I actually have money to pay for it now. $38 whole. Ruby laughed, but as they walked toward the car, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between them. Something that made her heart race and her palms sweat and her rational mind scream warnings she was determined to ignore. She was definitely, completely, irreversibly falling for Steve Whitmore. And for the first time in her life, she thought that might not be a mistake. Day 4 of Steve's new life arrived with a phone call that made Ruby's blood run cold. "Eleanor Whitmore is downstairs," Sarah announced, bursting into Ruby's apartment at 7 a.m. like she was reporting an alien invasion. "And she brought lawyers, plural, and they're asking questions about you." Steve, who had been making coffee with the concentration of someone defusing a bomb, froze mid-pour. "My mother is here?" "Your mother is here with what appears to be the entire legal department of Whitmore Industries, and she looks like she's planning to either adopt me or have me arrested, possibly both." Sarah grabbed Ruby's arm. "What the hell did you two do?" Ruby looked at Steve, who had gone pale under his 3-day stubble. For the past 4 days, they'd been living in a bubble, him teaching, her working at the flower shop, both of them pretending that the outside world didn't exist. But bubbles, Ruby was learning, had a tendency to burst at the worst possible moments. "She found us," Steve said quietly. "How? Does it matter?" Steve set down the coffee pot and ran his hands through his hair. "She's Eleanor Whitmore. Finding people is what she does when they inconvenience her." A sharp knock on the door made all 3 of them jump. Ruby opened it to find herself face to face with a woman who looked like she'd been carved from marble in disapproval. "Miss Anderson." Eleanor Whitmore's voice could have frozen hellfire. "We need to talk." "Mrs. Whitmore." Ruby stepped aside, because arguing with a force of nature seemed like a losing proposition. "Please, come in." Eleanor swept into the tiny apartment like she was inspecting a crime scene, taking in the mismatched furniture and the plants and the general sense that people actually lived here instead of just existing in carefully curated spaces. "Stephen," she said, not looking at her son, "you will pack your things. We're leaving." "No." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Eleanor turned to face Steve with the expression of someone who had never, in her entire life, heard that particular word directed at her. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no." Steve stepped closer to Ruby, not quite touching her, but close enough that his presence felt like protection. "I'm not coming back. Don't be ridiculous. You've had your little rebellion. It's been very dramatic and I'm sure quite therapeutic. But it's time to come home and fix the mess you've made." "What mess?" Eleanor's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "The Ashworth family is considering a breach of contract lawsuit over the humiliation you caused their daughter. The society pages are having a field day with your romantic breakdown. And the board of directors is questioning whether you're mentally stable enough to inherit the company." Ruby felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was it. The moment when Steve's real life came crashing back into their fantasy. But Steve didn't flinch. "Let them question it. Let the Ashworths sue. And as for the society pages," he shrugged, "I don't really care what they think anymore. You will care when you're broke and unemployed and living in—" Eleanor gestured dismissively at Ruby's apartment. This, Steve said, his voice getting harder, "is the first place I've ever felt like home." Eleanor's gaze shifted to Ruby with laser precision. "Miss Anderson, you seem like a sensible young woman. Surely you understand that this infatuation is temporary. Stephen has never had to work for anything in his life. The novelty of playing at being middle class will wear off, and when it does, he'll resent you for encouraging this fantasy." Ruby felt like she'd been slapped, because somewhere in the back of her mind, she'd been thinking the same thing. "And when that happens," Eleanor continued, her voice softer now, almost kind, "you'll be the one who gets hurt. Because men like my son don't actually give up their inheritance for love, Miss Anderson. They just like to think they would." The silence that followed was deafening. Ruby could feel Steve looking at her, waiting for her to defend what they'd built together. But Eleanor's words had hit too close to every insecurity Ruby had been trying to ignore. "Ruby," Steve said quietly, "don't listen to her." "Shouldn't I?" The words came out before Ruby could stop them. "Steve, she's right. You've known me for 4 days, as anything other than your wedding florist. 4 days. And you're willing to give up everything for that. I'm not giving up everything. I'm choosing something better. Are you? Or are you just running away from responsibility and using me as an excuse? Steve looked like she'd physically struck him. Is that what you think this is? Ruby wanted to say no. She wanted to say that she believed in him, in them, in the possibility that love could actually triumph over practicality. But Eleanor Whitmore's words had awakened every doubt she'd been suppressing. I think, Ruby said carefully, that maybe you need to figure out who you are without me complicating things. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus was having his own moment of truth with Vivian, though his was considerably more pleasant and significantly less devastating. So, Vivian said, looking up from the chessboard where she had just thoroughly demolished his king. Now that we've established that you're manipulative, strategic, and willing to orchestrate elaborate schemes to get what you want, I have a question. Just one? Was any of it real? She leaned back in her chair, studying his face. The friendship with Steve, the concern for my happiness, the whole noble best man routine. Marcus considered lying. It would be easier, more flattering, more likely to get him what he wanted. But something in Vivian's expression told him that dishonesty would be a fatal mistake. The friendship with Steve is real. He's been my best friend since we were 18, and I genuinely want him to be happy. Marcus moved his defeated king off the board. But I also genuinely believed he was going to make you miserable, and I thought I could make you happy instead. And the concern for my happiness? Real but selfish. I wanted you to be happy with me. Vivian smiled, the first completely genuine smile he'd seen from her. Good answer. Good enough to earn me a second date? Marcus, this is our first date. Then good enough to make this an actual date instead of a post-wedding crisis management session? Vivian reached across the table and straightened his tie, a gesture so intimate and unexpected that Marcus forgot how to breathe. I suppose, she said, we could call it that. Back in Ruby's apartment, the conversation had reached the point of no return. Fine, Steve said, his voice hollow. If that's what you want. It's not about what I want, Ruby replied, though her heart was breaking with every word. It's about what's realistic. Since when do you care about realistic? You're the woman who told me my life could use more chaos. Maybe I was wrong. Steve stared at her for a long moment, and Ruby saw something die in his eyes. The hope, the possibility, the belief that they could make this work, all of it fading into resignation. Maybe you were, he said quietly. He turned to his mother. I'll pack my things. Eleanor nodded, satisfied. The car is waiting downstairs. As Steve gathered his few belongings, the borrowed clothes, the lesson plans he'd worked so hard on, the copy of Ruby's favorite book she'd lent him, Ruby felt like she was watching herself make the biggest mistake of her life in slow motion. But she didn't stop him. At the door, Steve paused. For what it's worth, Ruby, it was real for me. All of it. And then he was gone, leaving Ruby alone in her apartment with the lingering scent of his cologne and the devastating certainty that she had just let the best thing that ever happened to her walk out the door. Outside, as Steve climbed into the back of his mother's Bentley, he looked up at Ruby's window one last time. She was standing there, watching him leave, tears streaming down her face. And for the first time in his life, Steve Whitmore understood what it felt like to have his heart completely and utterly broken. 2 weeks later, Steve Whitmore was officially back where he belonged, in a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's rent, and feeling absolutely miserable. The Pemberton account needs your signature, his assistant said, sliding a stack of papers across his mahogany desk. And your mother wants to see you at 4 about the charity gala seating arrangements. Steve signed without reading, which was exactly the kind of dangerous behavior that had gotten him into trouble in the first place. But caring about corporate acquisitions and charity gala seating arrangements required a level of emotional investment he no longer possessed. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Drinks tonight? V wants to meet at that new place in Soho." Steve stared at the message. Marcus and Vivian. Of course. While his own life had imploded spectacularly, his best friend had somehow managed to turn a wedding disaster into the romance of the century. The society pages were calling them the love story that emerged from scandal, and Steve was trying very hard not to resent them for their happiness. He typed back, "Can't. Board meeting prep." It was a lie. The board meeting wasn't until Thursday, and Steve had already reviewed the quarterly reports 3 times because he had nothing else to do with his evenings except sit in his penthouse and think about brown eyes and terrible coffee and the way Ruby's face had looked when she told him to leave. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, Ruby Anderson was learning that heartbreak had a very specific sound. The silence left behind when someone who had become essential to your daily routine suddenly wasn't there anymore. "You look like death," Sarah announced, setting a cup of decent coffee on Ruby's work table. The flower shop had been unusually busy. Apparently, romantic disasters made people want to send more flowers, not fewer, but Ruby had been operating on autopilot for 2 weeks. "I feel like death." Have you talked to him? What would be the point?" Ruby stabbed a rose stem with more force than was strictly necessary. "His mother was right. We had 4 days, Sarah. 4 days of playing house, and I convinced myself it was some grand love story. Maybe it was. Grand love stories don't end with the guy going back to his trust fund and the girl arranging flowers for other people's happiness." Sarah perched on the edge of the work table, watching Ruby assault innocent peonies. "You know what I think? That I should get therapy and move on with my life? I think you're scared." Ruby looked up from her flowers. "Of course I'm scared. Do you know what his mother said to me? She said men like Steve don't actually give up their inheritance for love." And she was right, Sarah. The minute things got complicated, he chose the money. Did he, though? He left. You told him to leave. Ruby was quiet for a moment, considering this. Because it was the right thing to do. Was it? Or was it the safe thing to do? Before Ruby could answer, the bell above the shop door chimed. A delivery guy entered carrying a massive arrangement that looked like it had been designed by someone with unlimited resources and questionable taste. "Ruby Anderson? That's me." He set the arrangement on the counter. 2 dozen white roses, baby's breath, and enough ribbon to gift wrap a small building. Ruby pulled out the card with hands that were definitely not trembling. "Thank you for helping me see clearly. Eleanor Whitmore." Ruby stared at the card. Eleanor Whitmore was thanking her for breaking her own heart, for sending Steve back to his old life, for choosing practical reality over impossible dreams. "Wow," Sarah said, reading over her shoulder. "That's some next-level passive aggression." Ruby crumpled the card and threw it in the trash. Then she looked at the arrangement, all that expensive perfection, all that cold, calculated beauty, and felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 weeks. Anger. Pure, white-hot, absolutely justified anger. "Sarah," she said, her voice very calm, "I need you to watch the shop." "Where are you going?" Ruby grabbed her keys and headed for the door. "To remind Eleanor Whitmore that she doesn't get to thank me for being a coward." Across town, Steve was sitting in yet another pointless meeting when his assistant knocked on the conference room door. "Mr. Whitmore, there's a situation in the lobby." Steve looked up from the spreadsheet he'd been pretending to care about. "What kind of situation?" "A woman. She's asking to see you, and when security tried to redirect her to your assistant, she told them she wasn't leaving until she talked to the coward in the expensive suit who thinks money can solve everything." Several board members turned to stare at Steve. He had a sinking feeling he knew exactly who was in the lobby. "Excuse me," he said, standing up so quickly his chair rolled backwards. "I need to handle this." Ruby Anderson was standing in the middle of Whitmore Industries' marble lobby like she owned the place, still wearing her flower shop apron and looking like she could take on an army of corporate lawyers with nothing but righteous indignation and a really good manicure. "Ruby." Steve's voice came out rougher than he'd intended. 2 weeks without seeing her, and she still hit him like a physical blow. "What are you doing here?" "Your mother sent me flowers." "She what?" "White roses. Very expensive, with a thank you note for helping her get her son back." Ruby stepped closer, and Steve could see the fire in her brown eyes. "She thanked me, Steve, for being too scared to fight for something real." Steve felt something shift in his chest. "Ruby, no, you don't get to talk yet. I'm not done." She was on a roll now, her voice getting stronger with every word. "2 weeks ago, I let fear make my decisions. I let your mother convince me that what we had wasn't real, that it couldn't last, that I was just some temporary rebellion in your perfectly planned life. It wasn't. But you know what I figured out while I've been spending the last 2 weeks feeling sorry for myself?" Ruby stepped even closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, that light, floral scent that had haunted his dreams. "I figured out that your mother was wrong about one thing." "What's that?" "She said men like you don't give up their inheritance for love." "But that's not what happened, is it?" Ruby's voice got softer, more dangerous. "You didn't choose money over love, Steve. You chose to respect my decision when I got scared and pushed you away." Steve felt like someone had just rewired his entire nervous system. "Ruby, I was wrong," she said simply. "About everything. About you not being worth the chaos. About this being too complicated to work. About love not being enough to build something real on." The lobby had gone completely silent. Security guards, receptionists, and several very expensive lawyers were all pretending not to eavesdrop on what was clearly the most interesting thing that had happened in the Whitmore Industries lobby since the building opened. "So," Ruby continued, her voice now loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'm here to ask you a question. Stephen Montgomery Whitmore III." "What question?" Ruby smiled, and Steve felt his heart stop. "Do you want to come home?" The word hung in the air between them like a promise. Home. Not to his penthouse with its view of Central Park and its Egyptian cotton sheets. Home to a tiny apartment in Brooklyn with mismatched furniture and terrible coffee, and a woman who saw him clearly and loved him anyway. "Ruby," Steve said quietly, "I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering." She reached for his hands, and he let her take them. "I don't want the easy love, Steve. I don't want the safe choice or the practical decision or the relationship that makes sense on paper. I want the love that's worth fighting for, the kind that makes you run out of churches and leave board meetings and choose something better than what you're supposed to want." Steve looked down at their joined hands, her small, strong fingers intertwined with his, and felt something he'd given up hope of ever feeling again. Possibility. "There's something you should know." "What?" "I've been going back to Jefferson High, after work, on weekends, volunteering." Steve's voice got stronger. "Mrs. Rodriguez offered me a full-time position. The pay is still terrible, but—" "But?" Steve smiled, and it was the first real smile he'd managed in 2 weeks. "But I think I want to take it." Ruby's answering smile was brilliant enough to power the entire building. "Stephen Whitmore, are you telling me you're going to choose love over money after all?" "I'm telling you," Steve said, pulling her closer, "that I'm going to choose you. Over money, over family expectations, over everything else that doesn't matter. Even if it means giving up all this." Ruby gestured at the marble and the mahogany and the general atmosphere of expensive power. "Ruby," Steve said, his voice full of certainty for the first time in weeks, "all of this was never home. You are." And then finally, in front of God and security cameras, and Eleanor Whitmore's entire corporate empire, Stephen Montgomery Whitmore III kissed Ruby Anderson like his life depended on it. Because, as it turned out, it did. Eleanor Whitmore arrived at Ruby's flower shop precisely 24 hours after the lobby incident, which had already made the evening news, 3 gossip blogs, and someone's viral TikTok. She entered like an empress surveying conquered territory, except the territory in question was aggressively refusing to be conquered. "Miss Anderson," Eleanor's voice could have frozen champagne, We need to discuss your little performance yesterday. Ruby didn't look up from the wedding arrangement she was assembling. Ironically, for a couple who had met when the bride accidentally crashed the groom's car and somehow turned it into the beginning of their love story. Mrs. Whitmore. I'd offer you coffee, but I'm pretty sure you only drink the tears of your enemies. Eleanor's smile was sharp as a scalpel. How delightfully dramatic. I can see why Stephen finds you entertaining. Is that what you think this is? Entertainment? I think, Eleanor said, settling into the shop's only chair like she was claiming a throne, that you're a young woman who's confused infatuation with love and temporary rebellion with permanent change. Ruby set down her wire cutters and finally looked at Steve's mother. Really looked at her. Eleanor Whitmore was beautiful in the way that money and good breeding could make someone beautiful. Perfectly maintained, flawlessly presented, and utterly cold. You know what's funny? Ruby said. Steve told me you'd say exactly that. Did he? He also told me that you've never actually been in love. Not once. That you married his father because it made financial sense, and you've spent 30 years trying to convince yourself that practical partnerships are better than passionate ones. Eleanor's composure cracked just slightly. Stephen has always been prone to romantic fantasizing. Has he? Because from where I'm standing, he's the most practical person I know. He left a loveless engagement, found work that actually matters to him, and chose a life that makes him happy over one that makes him rich. Ruby stepped closer. That doesn't sound like fantasy to me. That sounds like the smartest decision he's ever made. Miss Anderson. Ruby. My name is Ruby. And if you're going to try to destroy my life, you might as well use it. Eleanor studied her with new interest. You really think you can make him happy? I think we can make each other happy. Which is more than you can say for the life you had planned for him. The life I planned for him includes security, status, and a future without financial worry. The life I'm offering him includes purpose, passion, and a future without emotional emptiness. Ruby crossed her arms. But here's the thing, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm not actually here to convince you that I'm good enough for your son. No. I'm here to tell you that he's good enough for me. And if you can't see that, if you can't see that the man who walked away from everything he was raised to want because he'd found something better is extraordinary, then that's your loss, not mine. The shop bell chimed, and Steve walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee and looking like he hadn't slept in days. Mother. His voice was carefully neutral. I thought I might find you here. Stephen. I was just having an illuminating conversation with your friend. Steve handed Ruby one of the coffees, the good kind from the expensive place 3 blocks away, and positioned himself next to her like a shield. Ruby's not my friend, he said quietly. She's the woman I'm going to marry. Both women stared at him. Ruby nearly dropped her coffee. You're what now? Ruby managed. Steve turned to face her, and Ruby saw something in his eyes that made her heart stop and start again in the same moment. I'm asking you to marry me, he said simply. Not because it's dramatic, not because it proves a point to anyone, and definitely not because we need to make some grand gesture to validate our relationship. He paused, and his voice got softer. I'm asking because I want to spend the rest of my life with the woman who saw something worth saving in me when I couldn't see it myself. Stephen, Eleanor said sharply, you cannot be serious. I'm completely serious. Steve didn't take his eyes off Ruby. I know we haven't been together long. I know this is fast, and I know it probably seems crazy to everyone who thinks they know what's best for us. It is crazy, Ruby whispered. Yes, it is. And Ruby Anderson, you're the one who told me my life could use more chaos. Ruby felt tears starting in her eyes, but she was smiling so hard her face hurt. I can't believe you're proposing to me in my flower shop while your mother plots my assassination. I can't believe it took me this long to ask. Eleanor stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking completely. This is ridiculous. Stephen, you're throwing away everything, your inheritance, your position in society, your entire future, For someone you barely know." Steve turned to face his mother, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, but absolutely final. "Mother, I love you, but you're wrong about everything that matters." He took Ruby's hand, and she felt the rightness of it down to her bones. "I'm not throwing away my future. I'm finally claiming it. The board will never accept this. The family will never accept this. Then I guess it's a good thing I don't need their acceptance anymore." Eleanor stared at her son for a long moment, and Ruby saw something flicker across her face that might have been recognition, or respect, or possibly just shock. "You're really going to do this," Eleanor said finally. "I really am." Eleanor looked at Ruby, then back at Steve, then at the flower shop with its mismatched chairs and its walls covered in photos of couples who'd found their happy endings in spite of impossible odds. "Fine," she said, and her voice was different now, quieter, less certain. "But when this implodes spectacularly, don't come crying to me." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Miss Anderson, Ruby." "Yes?" "Make him happy, because if you break his heart, I'll make your life very difficult." Ruby smiled. "Mrs. Whitmore, if I break his heart, you'll have to get in line behind me." Eleanor almost smiled. Almost. Then she swept out of the shop, leaving Steve and Ruby alone with the lingering scent of expensive perfume and burnt bridges. "So," Ruby said, looking down at their joined hands, Marriage. That's a pretty big decision to make in front of your terrifying mother." "Ruby," Steve said, pulling her closer, "I made that decision 2 weeks ago, when I realized that losing you was the only thing that actually scared me anymore." "And the inheritance? The family business? All of it?" Steve was quiet for a moment, considering. "Do you know what I realized yesterday, when I was sitting in another pointless meeting about quarterly projections?" "What?" "I was miserable when I had everything, and I've been happy with nothing but you and a teaching job that pays $38 a day." He cupped her face in his hands. "I think that tells me everything I need to know about what actually matters." Ruby felt something settle in her chest, warm and sure and absolutely terrifying in the best possible way. "Stephen Montgomery Whitmore III, she said. "Are you asking me to marry you properly, or are we just going to keep talking about it while I die of suspense?" Steve laughed, the real laugh, the one that made him look 10 years younger and infinitely less burdened by the weight of other people's expectations. "Ruby Anderson," he said, dropping to one knee right there in her flower shop, surrounded by arrangements for other people's love stories, "will you marry me?" Ruby looked down at this impossible man who had given up everything for love and was now proposing without a ring in a shop that smelled like roses and possibility. "Yes," she said, and her voice was strong and sure and absolutely certain. "Yes, I will marry you." When Steve kissed her this time, Ruby tasted freedom and courage and the kind of happiness that poets wrote about, but most people never actually experienced. And outside, unbeknownst to either of them, Eleanor Whitmore sat in her car for a very long time, watching her son laugh with pure joy for the first time in his adult life, and wondering if maybe, just maybe, she'd been wrong about everything that mattered. 6 months later, Ruby Anderson was getting married in the same church where this whole beautiful disaster had started, except this time, everything was wonderfully, perfectly wrong. Instead of 200 society elite, there were 30 people who actually mattered. Her flower shop customers, Steve's students from Jefferson High, Sarah with her bright pink hair serving as maid of honor, and Marcus standing as best man with the satisfied expression of someone whose elaborate schemes had worked out better than he'd ever dared hope. Instead of imported white orchids that cost more than a car, Ruby had chosen wildflowers, daisies and sunflowers and roses that looked like they'd been picked from someone's backyard garden, which they basically had been. Instead of a designer gown that required 3 assistants and architectural engineering, Ruby wore a vintage dress she'd found at a consignment shop in the village, alterations done by Mrs. Chen from the dry cleaner, who'd cried when Ruby asked if she could help make it perfect. And instead of Eleanor Whitmore orchestrating every detail with military precision, The whole thing was beautifully, chaotically imperfect, exactly the way Ruby and Steve had planned it. "You ready for this?" Sarah asked, adjusting Ruby's simple veil, her grandmother's, the only fancy thing she was wearing. "I've been ready since the day he ran out of this church like his life depended on it," Ruby replied, checking her reflection in the church's tiny mirror. She looked happy, really, genuinely, radiantly happy in a way that had nothing to do with expensive makeup or professional photography. Outside in the sanctuary, Steve was having his own moment of reckoning with how perfectly imperfect everything was. "Nervous?" Marcus asked, straightening Steve's tie. A simple blue one that matched his eyes, nothing like the elaborate silk monstrosity he'd worn to his almost wedding 6 months ago. "Terrified," Steve admitted. "But not about marrying Ruby, about whether I deserve to be this happy." "Dude," Marcus said, and his voice was more serious than Steve had heard it in years. "You gave up a fortune for love. You walked away from everything you were raised to want because you found something better. If that doesn't qualify you for happiness, nothing does. Besides," Marcus thought with barely contained satisfaction, "your breakdown was the best thing that ever happened to my love life. Vivian and I are engaged. You're marrying the love of your life. And I managed to orchestrate the whole thing without anyone realizing how brilliantly manipulative I am. This is definitely going down in history as my masterpiece of romantic scheming." "Marcus," Steve said, noticing his friend's slightly smug expression, "you're not thinking about how you engineered all of this, are you? Would I do that at your wedding?" "Yes, you absolutely would." Marcus grinned. "Okay, maybe a little. But only because I'm genuinely happy for you. And also because Vivian said if our wedding goes half as well as yours is going to, she'll consider it a success." Steve looked around the church, at his students sitting in the front row wearing their best clothes and looking genuinely excited to be there, at Ruby's customers dabbing their eyes with tissues, at the photographer they'd hired from Craigslist, who was capturing everything with the kind of joy that came from documenting real love instead of social obligation. "You know what's funny?" Steve said. "What?" "6 months ago, I thought I had everything. Money, status, the perfect bride, the perfect wedding, the perfect life all planned out." Steve paused as the organ music started. Not the formal wedding march, but "At Last" by Etta James, because Ruby had insisted on something that actually meant something, and I was absolutely miserable. And now? Steve smiled as Ruby appeared at the back of the church, walking down the aisle on her father's arm. Not the elaborate procession with 6 bridesmaids and a flower girl, but just Ruby, looking like she was walking toward her entire future. "Now I have nothing but a teaching job that pays barely enough to live on, a fiancé who argues with me about everything, and a 1-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn with a refrigerator that makes weird noises." "Sounds terrible," Marcus said, but he was smiling. "It's perfect," Steve replied, and his voice was full of wonder. "It's absolutely perfect." Ruby reached the altar, and when Steve saw her up close, saw the happiness in her brown eyes and the way she was trying not to cry and completely failing, he felt something click into place that he hadn't even realized was missing. "Hi," she whispered, as her father kissed her cheek and stepped back. "Hi yourself," Steve whispered back, taking her hands. "You look like I raided a thrift store and convinced an old lady to alter the dress. Like the most beautiful woman who's ever agreed to put up with me for the rest of her life." The ceremony was short and sweet and absolutely nothing like what either of their mothers would have planned. The pastor, the same one who'd been prepared to officiate Steve's disaster 6 months ago, kept it simple and heartfelt, focusing on love and commitment and the courage it takes to choose each other every single day. When it came time for vows, Steve went first. "Ruby," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the small church, 6 months ago, you told me I was an entitled ass who wouldn't recognize real love if it bit me on my perfectly manicured behind." Laughter rippled through the congregation, including from several of his students who had clearly never imagined their history teacher getting married, much less admitting to having a perfectly manicured anything. "You were right," Steve continued, his voice getting softer. I didn't know what love was. I thought it was something you negotiated, something you planned, something you chose based on logic and compatibility and social expectations. Ruby squeezed his hands, encouraging him. But then you taught me that real love isn't logical. It's terrifying and exhilarating and completely transformative. It makes you want to be better than you are, even when you're not sure you know how to be better. Steve's voice cracked slightly. You saw something worth saving in me when I couldn't see it myself. You believed I could be the man I wanted to be instead of just the man I was supposed to be. Ruby was crying now, not caring that her carefully applied mascara was probably running. So I promise you this, Steve said, his voice getting stronger. I promise to choose you every single day, even when it's hard, even when it's scary, even when my mother sends disapproving looks that could freeze hellfire. More laughter, and even Eleanor, sitting in the third row wearing a navy suit and a carefully neutral expression, almost smiled. I promise to build a life with you that's messy and imperfect and absolutely nothing like what anyone expected from us. And I promise to love you with everything I have, everything I am, and everything I'm still learning to become. When it was Ruby's turn, she took a shaky breath and looked directly into Steve's eyes. Steve, she said, I've spent my whole life believing that love was something that happened to other people, the kind of people who were prettier, or smarter, or more deserving than me. Steve started to protest, but Ruby shook her head, smiling through her tears. But then this arrogant, impossible, beautifully broken man ran out of his own wedding and dragged me into the most chaotic, terrifying, wonderful adventure of my life. The students in the front row were eating this up, and Steve made a mental note that he was never going to live this down in his classroom. You taught me that love isn't about deserving anything, Ruby continued. It's about choosing to be brave enough to let someone see all of you, the good parts and the messy parts and the parts you're not sure you like about yourself, and trusting them to love you anyway. Steve felt something tight in his chest loosen completely. So I promise to be brave with you. I promise to challenge you when you need challenging, support you when you need supporting, and love you especially when you're being impossible. Ruby grinned. I promise to make terrible coffee and argue with your mother and fill our home with plants that will probably die because I forget to water them. And I promise, she said, her voice getting softer, to choose this chaos with you, every single day, for the rest of our lives. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Steve kissed Ruby like his life depended on it, which, as it turned out, it did. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall, decorated with more of Ruby's wildflowers and string lights that Sarah had hung with questionable regard for electrical safety. The cake was from the bakery down the street from Ruby's flower shop, the music came from Marcus's carefully curated playlist, and the whole thing felt like the world's best dinner party instead of a formal wedding reception. So, Vivian said, approaching Ruby during the father-daughter dance that was actually just Ruby dancing with anyone who wanted to, including 3 of Steve's more enthusiastic students. How does it feel to be Mrs. Whitmore? Terrifying and perfect, Ruby replied, watching Steve attempt to teach the electric slide to his former Latin teacher. How does it feel to be planning your own wedding to the man who orchestrated this entire romantic disaster? Vivian followed Ruby's gaze to Marcus, who was currently explaining to anyone who would listen how he'd always known that Steve and Ruby were meant to be together. Like I'm marrying the most manipulative man in Connecticut, and I'm completely okay with that, Vivian said with a smile. He asked me to marry him by presenting a PowerPoint presentation titled, Why Vivian Ashworth Should Marry Marcus Pemberton, a Data-Driven Analysis. Did it work? Slide number 14 was, Because I Love You More Than Steve Ever Could Have. And slide 15 was just a picture of us dancing at your engagement party. Vivian's smile got softer. I said yes before he got to slide 16. Later, as the evening wound down and the last of their guests filtered out into the warm summer night, Steve and Ruby found themselves alone in the church sanctuary where everything had started. No regrets? Ruby asked, leaning against Steve's shoulder as they sat in the front pew. About giving up the money? The family business? The life I was supposed to have? About any of it. Steve was quiet for a moment, looking around at the church that had witnessed both his greatest mistake and his greatest triumph. "Do you know what I was thinking about during the ceremony?" he asked. "How good I look in white. How 6 months ago, I was standing in this exact spot, about to marry someone I didn't love because it was what I was supposed to do. And today, I married the woman who taught me what it means to want something more than I want to be safe." Ruby tilted her head to look at him. And I realized that running out of that wedding wasn't the crazy thing. Staying would have been crazy. Steve kissed the top of her head. "Marrying you is the sanest thing I've ever done. Even though I'm going to make you eat grocery store coffee and live in a one-bedroom apartment and probably argue with you about money for the rest of our lives. Especially because of that." Ruby laughed, the sound echoing in the empty church. "Stephen Whitmore, I think you might actually be worth all the trouble I went through to save you." "Ruby Whitmore," Steve said, and the name sounded perfect, like it had always been meant to be hers. "I think we might actually live happily ever after. Even without the money. Especially without the money." As they walked out of the church hand in hand, heading toward their borrowed car and their uncertain but absolutely perfect future, neither of them noticed Eleanor Whitmore sitting in her Bentley across the street. She'd watched the entire ceremony from a distance, and now she was watching her son laugh with his new wife as they drove away toward a life that was nothing like what she'd planned for him. For the first time in 30 years, Eleanor Whitmore wondered if, maybe, just maybe, there were some things more valuable than money after all. But that, as they say, is another story entirely. The end. Ruby and Steve Whitmore went on to have 3 children, a mortgage they could barely afford, and the kind of love story that made everyone who knew them believe in happy endings. Marcus and Vivian's wedding featured a 17-slide presentation about optimal seating arrangements and was considered the social event of the following year. Eleanor eventually learned to make peace with grocery store coffee, though she never quite got used to the idea that her son was happier poor than he'd ever been rich. Some stories end with everything going back to the way it was supposed to be. The best ones end with everything being better than anyone dared to imagine.